Hopefully, yeah. Hopefully, in the next time you can visit Indonesia, not only virtual but directly, yeah, yeah, physically. Sorry. Sorry, a bit echo here. Sorry. My mobile phone make echo ya. Ya. Mbak Ratih, suara saya jelas atau echo?
Sudah jelas, Pak.
Oh ya. Please my apologies because I thought that the voice is echoing. Yeah. So once more, thank you very much for Professor Petrus de Vries, and hopefully, yeah, what I can say today is we are feel so honored having you today, yeah, and hopefully we can learn a lot from you because from what I hear from Dian, you are really expert in autism, yeah, and I think the topic is very contextual with our conditions, yeah, and for your informations, uh, our faculty psychology of University of Muhammadiyah Malang, we have tagline which is applying psychology and welfaring humanity. So from this tagline you can understand what is our visions, yeah. And secondly, I can give information to you that actually since 2008 our faculty has been a pioneer, yeah, and also until now, yeah, we are very active in the development programs for individual special needs individuals, and also we are involved in encouraging and promoting inclusive education in Indonesia. However, we still want to improve our contributions because we need more people concerned in this area. And then hopefully, I really hope, Professor, this meeting, yeah, this event be the one and only our meeting. I really hope meetings we can have another communication and possibly we can develop a collaboration program between our Indonesia and also possibly you personally or your institution, Cape Town University, and together we can increase the welfare special need individuals. That's all I think that I can say, and I really want to enjoy this meeting until then. For all participants, either or my students, please don't hesitate. Professor Petrus, a lot of questions. I think he will be happy, yeah, with a lot, yeah, because we need learns a lot from his experience, yeah, and what there are three key to be success in our life. The first one is we don't hesitate to ask, we always asking, and never being tired to ask. So don't worry, yeah, and yeah, ask to him a lot of best, we learn a lot from him. That's all what I can say. Sorry if a bit messy, yeah. Thank you. Really waiting for and so excited to hear your explanation, Prof. Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you to Dr. Salis, our Dean, for the opening speech. Well, I will read the curriculum vitae of Prof. De Vries. Who will be the speaker in our event today. In resource limited environment, case studies from South Africa. Baik, teman-teman, Bapak Ibu sekalian, Prof. De Vries ini adalah profesor di bidang Child and Adolescent Psychiatry di Afrika, di Cape Town ini. Beliau belajar di South Africa di Stellenbosch University. Kemudian untuk bidang psikiatri anak dan remaja serta PhD dalam bidang developmental ini beliau masih mengajar dan juga melakukan riset di bidang neurodevelopmental dan mental health needs di South Africa. Saya akan menjelaskan. Setelah ini kita akan mendengarkan pemaparan dari Prof. Vries, kemudian apakah suara saya cukup bermasalah? Oke. Suara saya cukup terdengar ya, maaf. Ini tadi
ya barusan kedengeran Bu Rati tadi agak putus-putus.
Oke. Oke, sudah terdengar? Mohon maaf.
Sudah Bu Rati.
Oke, terima kasih. Setelah ini kita akan mendengarkan pemaparan dari Prof. De Vries. Kemudian nanti di chat box ada Mbak Irin sebagai co-host yang akan membantu menerjemahkan sehingga teman-teman sekalian tidak perlu khawatir jika ada hal-hal yang mungkin terlewat atau kurang dipahami karena kendala berbahasa. Kemudian nanti setelah gimana?
Ya barusan putus setelah kita ya, Po.
Barusan putus, oke.
Ya ini udah bagus lagi.
Oke. Kok menyala? Baik, nanti akan ada Mbak Irin yang akan membantu menerjemahkan lewat chat box. Kemudian untuk sesi tanya jawab nanti silahkan teman-teman menggunakan fitur raise hand. Kalau saya sudah mempersilahkan, silahkan nanti mengajukan pertanyaannya. Boleh dalam bahasa Indonesia, boleh dalam bahasa Inggris. Nanti kalau dalam bahasa Indonesia kami akan membantu menerjemahkannya untuk Profesor De Vries. Well, Prof. De Vries, okay. We'll have 45 minutes for you to present your presentation, and we will have Q&A session later after your presentation. So please take your time to present.
I'm sorry, Petrus, we cannot hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Okay, great. Yes, we can hear you now.
Yeah?
Yes, we can hear you now, clearly.
Okay, so the first thing to say, if the signal isn't good, it might be between me and you, so I can always restart again.
Yes, it's all right. I will let you know if we cannot hear you here.
I can hear you very slowly, so I think that's clear. And like Dr. Salis, I also hear an echo. Did you also hear an echo, Dr. Salis?
No, I can hear you clearly here.
We will have interpreter to translate your presentation, so it's okay for the audience, I think.
So let's try, and feel free to interrupt me if we need to start again. Okay.
Okay.
So let's keep our fingers crossed. Technology is sometimes on our side.
Okay, we can see your screen clearly.
Right. So firstly, thank you, Dr. Salis, for the lovely invitation and introduction. And I certainly hope that I can also get to your university team and Muhammadiyah Malang. And let's see if I can start my first picture. And that's to say thank you to Diane, because as you will have heard, the reason I'm talking about that is because Diane and I met at a research development seminar in 2019, and she and I were in a mentoring group together. And we had lots of really useful and interesting conversations. And here on this lovely picture, you can see Diane in the middle next to me, and next to her is Kotalawala. He is the president of the Sri Lankan Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, who is one of the group members. And next to him is Dr. Aisha Chachar Sanober from Pakistan, and she was also one of the group. So the four of us made a very nice, you can see, diverse group of people interested in child and adolescent mental health and neurodevelopmental disabilities. And so thank you, Diane, for all the good work you've done. And thank you for leading to this invitation to join you all today. So I'm very grateful for that. Let's move on to the next slide. So in the same way that you greet one another, salam alaikum, I shall greet you, salam alaikum, and also say greetings from Cape Town. Because here you can see on this picture the University of Cape Town, which is where I'm based. Here you see beautiful buildings, Table Mountain on the background, and the University of Cape Town, the main campus is there on the side of the mountain you can see. And I am based in the Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. And here you see all the buildings here in the front are part of the Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. So my office and my team are based right here at the bottom of beautiful Table Mountain. And I should greet you also from my research team. So my research team is called the Center for Autism Research in Africa, or CARA. And we're a very interdisciplinary group. So we have psychologists, occupational therapists, speech and language therapists, special educators, pediatricians, other kinds of scientists and engineers, and some medical professionals, like I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist, and we have some other mental health specialists as well. And we like being interdisciplinary because our belief is we cannot meet the needs of children with mental health problems and with neurodevelopmental disabilities unless we find ways of collaborating and of looking at the problem from different angles. Of course, as you know, this was the year of COVID-19. I don't know what COVID is like in Indonesia at the moment, but for most of 2020, this is what we looked like. We had to talk to each other on Zoom. We had to do all our work on Zoom as we are doing today. But in spite of that, I think we've been able to do a lot of interesting things in the year. And we've learned a lot, I think, about how we might do collaborative work through remote modalities and how to do research and clinical interventions through remote modalities as well. In our research team, we're interested in a broad range of aspects of research. So we're very interested in screening and diagnosis and how we might approach that. We're very interested in interventions for autism and other neurodevelopmental disabilities. We're very interested in educational and health systems. So it was lovely to hear Dr. Sally say you're interested in inclusive education and all these kinds of things as well. We're very interested in training. And you know, I don't know your part of the world, but in my part of the world, there are huge gaps in knowledge. And so how we find ways of training people is a really important thing for us. And we're very interested in technology, and I'll say a little bit about technology. But the key thing about our work is that everything we do, we have to look at through the cultural, the socioeconomic, and the linguistic diversity of our people. And I don't know much about your part of the world, but I know you are culturally, socioeconomically, and linguistically also very diverse. Just in my country, we have 11 official languages, and we have many, many different cultural groups. Our research is also interested not just in South Africa, but in a much broader space. And so throughout Africa and also throughout the world. Today, I suggested to Diane maybe we could talk about early intervention for autism in resource-limited settings. But I would be very happy if any of you want to ask me questions, as Dr. Salis has told you, about any of the other bits of our research in our question and answer time. So we don't need to just talk about intervention, but I thought intervention is a good starting place, and it's a nice kind of conversation to have about autism. And so the concept of early intervention is a logical one, is a sensible one, and it has two main principles. The first principle is to say, and if we think about autism, that what we want to do is if we look at the trajectory of typical development, and if we imagine that's a developmental trajectory that's a typical development, I don't think there's a word such as normal, and then a child with a neurodevelopmental disability, what we want to do, firstly, is we want to try and reduce the gap between the atypical trajectory and the typical trajectory. And you can see what's very clear if we think about things like autism. Typically in the first 6 to 12 months of life, we can't really pick up that difference. And it's usually at this sort of time that we start to see divergence in neurodevelopment and in output. And so the first principle of early intervention in autism is we want to try and we want to get in when this gap is as small as possible. Because the bigger the gap, the greater there may be also other and secondary deficits and secondary challenges. So our first principle is the sooner we can get in here, the more likely we may be to shift children back towards a typical developmental trajectory. And the second thing that I think is particularly relevant to autism and early intervention for autism, you can see that it starts to become quite clear between about the age of 2 and 3. And if you think, and I could hear, it was lovely to hear children in the background as we were preparing. If any of you have a child who's 2 years old, you can, and I ask you, how many words does your child have? How much do they communicate? Most of you would say, I can count the number of words my child has, maybe 50 words, maybe 30 words, maybe 70 words. By the time typically developing children are 3, their language has grown so much that we can no longer count it. So the second component of this is that we basically say that this is also the phase of brain development, of neurodevelopment, that we imagine, that we propose that the brain is most ready to do language and communication development. And so you could see there are 2 reasons why we want to try and get to children before this magical age of 3 that people often talk about. One is to reduce the gap. B is we think the brain is most ready to do this kind of developmental work at this age. But that sounds good, but it is not so easy to do this in low resource settings. And I'm first going to tell you some of the challenges in our setting, and then I will tell you what we've done or how differently in our settings. And then you should think what might be relevant in Indonesia, what might not be relevant, what other things might be relevant or important in our part of the world. So let me start with the first one. If we think about the whole world and why early intervention is a problem for all of us, here's number 1. Most children with autism and other disabilities live in low and middle income countries. So some work that we've done, published a few years ago, and there was another paper this year, shows that 95% of children with autism and related neurodevelopmental disabilities live in low and middle income countries. And only a tiny proportion actually live in high income countries. I think Indonesia is classified as a middle income country. I think you're an upper middle income country like my country. I think you recently moved up there, but it means that we are the part of the world where most children with autism and other disabilities live. And that's a really important fact for all of us to remember and to remind ourselves of. Because if we then look at the next challenge, we actually have very limited medical and other professional expertise in those parts of the world. I'm going to show you a picture. If you density. So how many doctors are there per population? And so here's the regular map, and here's the map of physician density. Can you see? There's Africa, and look at Africa again. Here's Africa. Can you see there? Tiny little bit is Africa. Now let's look at your part of the world. That also looks fairly thin to me in comparison, for instance, to the very high physician density in North America, the very high physician density in most European countries. So most children are here and most physicians and specialists are not. So that's a major challenge for our part of the world. The third challenge is most of the knowledge base, most research, most data about autism and other disabilities come from high-income countries and not from low and middle-income countries. In this scoping review we did a few years ago, just to illustrate, when we put together all of Africa, all the data from Africa and Latin American countries, fewer than 5% of all papers ever about autism came from those parts, those major parts of the world. And most came from North America and Europe, as you can see. Now, Asia, where you are, is sort of mixed in because it has both high income and low and middle income countries. So it's difficult. You can, maybe you've done some work to see how much work on autism has come from Indonesia, or maybe that's a nice project for one of your students. The fourth challenge for us in our parts of the world is we also live in very unequal societies. So if you look at this map, it shows Gini coefficient. So the Gini coefficient, richest people in a country, the greatest divide between rich and poor. Very difficult. I see here where Indonesia, your part of the world also that has quite high divide between rich and poor. Because what that means is if we're going to think about how we're going to do intervention, who do we need to do intervention with? Here, for instance, is just an illustration. This is Cape Town. This is the beautiful picture of Cape Town that you all want to visit and that I showed you the mountain of. And this is the kind of more affluent, also part of Cape Town. And so this is one of our high density areas, and you can see people live in very small shacks. They're called often one room, and often between 5 and 10 people might live in a small shack like this. They share running water between houses, they share toilets between houses. So that's a very different environment if you think, I want to try and do early intervention in this setting. So we need to be very thoughtful and mindful of, if we want to try and get to people who live here, we need to think very differently about how we support them in intervention. And of course, the fifth thing to say is in our parts of the world, our health systems and education systems and most systems are very limited. So for instance, but there's a typical gap of at least 2 years before any medical services or professional services are seen. And so you can see often we don't find children before that magical age of 3 that I mentioned, if we want to try and do early intervention with them. So that's a major challenge for us. How do we do intervention with children if we haven't found them yet, if we haven't identified them? So let me, before I go on to our possible solutions, how have we approached early intervention in South Africa? Let me just check with Rati. Rati, is the sound still okay? Can everyone still hear me all right?
It's okay.
Right.
Can you listen to me? Okay. Okay.
So what have we done in our part of the world? Well, the first, and I'm just going to give you 6 principles. So, and just to kind of illustrate some of the examples of how we've tried to approach these challenges. The first principle is we realize that what we need and what we want is a pyramid of interventions. And let me show you what I mean by that. Very often people think the intervention that I need for everybody in my country or for everybody in my clinic. And the realization is that that is not the right way to think about intervention. We need to pyramid from very basic, very simple, what I might call very low intensity and low frequency interventions that everybody should have access to. Maybe that's a 1 hour session or a 2 hour session or some basic stuff or knowledge or information, etc. And then many people might need to go on to low intensity and low frequency, but a little bit more than what was offered to them at the very bottom level. And then some might need to go on to more intensive work, and some might need something that's really quite high intensity. And only a small proportion of people should need the very specialist, very one-to-one, very long-term, very detailed intervention. Why this is important in our parts of the world is because very often many of the interventions that have been developed in the USA and in rich countries are focusing here at the high intensity, ultra high intensity things. If you need an intervention that requires 12 weeks or 18 weeks of 1 hour sessions, one-to-one with a highly specialist psychologist, that actually is up here. That's not what we can offer ever to everyone in our communities. So it's really important for us to think we need a range of different interventions across these levels. And what we then need to do is we need to find evidence and build a research evidence base for all these different levels. Okay. And that leads me on to the second principle, which is about the evidence base. And that is to say, evidence, saying something is an evidence-based intervention cannot and should not only be about efficacy. And let me explain to you what I mean by that. So for psychologists, this is a good principle to understand. So let's say I have a wonderful intervention that was developed in America for autism, and I say this thing has an evidence base. Normally what people mean is that this thing was like, for instance, a medication. Let's say you have a tablet and we say it has evidence. Normally what people do is they do a randomized controlled trial, and they say that this tablet is better than a placebo on the things that we were interested in. So that's efficacy. So that's really showing that the outcome of this thing is significantly better than the outcome of this thing. Does that make sense? So that's one piece of evidence. So let's say we have a wonderful intervention, and now I want to bring this intervention into my part of the world, into a place where people really need it. There's a big difference having an intervention tested in a research lab in America versus bringing that intervention into South Africa or into Indonesia or into your community. And that's where things become much more interesting and challenging. And so another way to try and explain it, and this is a lovely picture from Dr. Liesl Schillibusch, who's a social scientist in my team. So Liesl talks about the intervention as, we can think about it as the seeds. So you might have some good seeds. The intervention has really good seeds. And the question and then we think about the place where we want to have the intervention as the soil where we want to put the seed. And we think about the strategies we use to implement that intervention as the water or the watering can. Does that make sense? And so the question we want to ask is, what is the best seed for our soil in terms of an intervention? And because there might be some excellent seeds that grow well in an American soil, but it's not going to grow in South African soil. Or we might have something that's not so good in a different setting, but actually grows very well with the resources and the expertise and the communities we have. Or sometimes we can bring an intervention to our parts of the world, but it needs so much work and so much watering and so much supervision and training and ongoing input that in itself becomes non-sustainable. Because ultimately what we want is interventions that can be scalable to everyone and sustainable in the setting that we work. And so I'll give you one little example. John Joe Dawson-Squibb, who's a clinical psychologist in my team, John Joe wanted to ask the question, how do we know how to pick the best intervention for a particular setting. So let's say you're looking for an intervention for your clinic or for your city or for your district. And what John Joe did was he brought together, we realized that there are no standard frameworks or checklists or systems to do this. And he brought together parents, people with autism, implementation science people, clinicians, researchers, a huge range of professionals. And through a participatory process, asked them, how do we make that decision? And this is kind of the main finding. He did find that, of course, it's important that we have good outcomes, like that efficacy that I talked about. It has to be good outcomes for the child, for the parents, for the family, for the community. That's very important in our parts of the world. But we also need to make sure that this intervention is accessible to people, that it's acceptable, particularly culturally appropriate in our communities. That the whole psychological process through which this intervention is done should feel supportive to people. You all know when families live with developmental disabilities like autism, there's very often stigma, shame, guilt, feeling blamed, etc. And so the intervention process should feel supportive to families. And of course, it needs to be there needs to be good pathways for people to find these interventions. And then the third cog in this wheel is about, as I've said, is this sustainable? Is this intervention scalable? If only a small group of people can access it, it's not really good for our setting. And can we build it into existing systems of care? And that's a major challenge for those of us, including you guys. What we can't afford to do is to build parallel systems for intervention. So they need to be part of the systems that they already are. We can strengthen those systems, but we can't invent new parallel things for everything. That will never work in the world that we live in. And so that is why when we in our team talk about the kind of evidence for interventions, we look at least three main boxes. So yes, we look at the intervention outcomes that are the typical things that one might look at, but we also look at the implementation outcomes, the acceptability, the adaptability, the appropriateness, the feasibility in our setting. And then we also look at the fidelity. So fidelity means if I, as a specialist, do the intervention and you, as somebody who's not so specialist at the intervention, we do it equally well? Do we do it with the same rigor and in the same way? And that's a challenge for us in many interventions. Sometimes seeing an intervention, you think, well, that doesn't look like the CBT I know. So that's about fidelity. And so this picture comes from a paper, a chapter that we wrote recently, outlining exactly the kind of challenges that we're talking about today. I'll show you the paper again right at the end. So the third principle then is we need a pyramid. We need to look at more than efficacy. We also need to understand the needs of our families, and we need to understand our health and other systems, because that's the community we're serving, and that's the place where we need to embed these things. And if we think about, I don't know how many of you are interested or work in health systems research, but a very nice, simple way to think about it is this. Lucy Gilson, Professor Lucy Gilson is a health systems researcher here at the University of Cape Town. And she divides, when she talks about health systems, or any system, she differentiates between the hardware of the system and the software of the system. And I think that's a really nice way to think about it. So the hardware are the structures and the technology and the resources and things like that. The software is about the values, people's beliefs, the norms, societal norms, who the people are, the relationships between them. And what we need in a good system is there needs to be enough hardware, but we also need the right kind of software. And sometimes we can work on the software through relationships, networking, and other kind of things, even if we cannot yet change the hardware, because often this is about money, but this is not always about money. And so when we do research here now, what we try to do is we try to understand the policy landscape. What policies are there that we can use, are not yet there? What are the resources that are available in our city, in our country, in our continent? What do the senior stakeholders think? So these are the people, the decision makers, the funders, the people who run services, the senior government people, because we need to understand how they think in order to know how to influence that process. We need to understand what providers, clinicians, people who run services, what their views are and experiences are. And of course, we fundamentally need to understand how families, people with autism, with disabilities, and their families, how they experience the services that they're receiving. Because ultimately, we need to make sure that it meets their needs, not just the needs of people around them. And so you will see, if you were to look and read at some of the things that we've done a lot of work really trying to understand some of these things. So this is just one example, a paper where we've done qualitative work with families who live with autism, asking them about how do many things came up, for instance, about cultural belief systems. So in most of Africa, people have what we call pluralistic beliefs about disability. On the one hand, most people believe that it's because they've done something wrong to their ancestors, or it was a curse, or it was something supernatural. And they seek interventions through more medical or traditional routes. And so it's important for us to understand and acknowledge the different positions. And I'm going to guess that you must have some similar pluralistic or differential belief systems about disability and illness in your part of the world too. And we need to understand what languages do people want intervention, because we have so many languages. Where do people want the intervention? How do we not make stigma worse in our communities? And I'll just give you one example, which is in South Africa, we have very high rates of HIV. And so we have a very strong community program for HIV support to families. And when we interviewed families about autism and said, would you have a community health worker come to your house in the community rather than for you to come to a clinic? People said to us, sure, you can. I'm happy to have a community health worker come to me, but I do not want somebody who comes from my own community. I want somebody who comes from a different community, because otherwise they might gossip about me and they might talk about my family. And that comes from the sensitivity and the stigma associated with HIV, where people were very embarrassed and ashamed about stigma in that kind of context. So we've also done similar kinds of work asking senior stakeholders, providers, what laws are there? What policies are there? What do you think about disability? And that was very helpful for us to understand that actually many of our senior decision makers in the country still know very little about autism. They don't think about autism as different from other disabilities. They put all disabilities in the same box. They mostly think about physical disabilities and not about neurodevelopmental disabilities, about autism and other developmental disabilities. And one of the key things that's come out over and over, and I'm just summarizing briefly because we don't want to talk too long, is a theme that came up over and over again is that caregiver coaching. Coaching parents and caregivers is likely to be the most helpful mechanism for us to provide early intervention, in particular for autism and other disabilities. And so that's really what shifted the focus of our work. The fourth principle, and this one may sound strange to you, is we realize that we cannot wait until a child has a diagnosis. Do you remember I said we typically wait at least 2 years from mum being worried to actually seeing a doctor or a professional? And so we realized if we wait until a child has a diagnosis of autism or any disability, we will miss that opportunity for early intervention. And that's also why we became very interested in the World Health Organization Caregiver Skills Training Program, the CST. I don't know if any of you are involved in the WHO CST. This is a program for caregivers of infants and young children, so it goes up to the kind of early primary years, with developmental delays. And so the key thing here is a child doesn't have to have a diagnosis. All they need is mum to be worried about my child's language development, or about their social development, or about anything like that. And that is enough for them then to have access to this group-based training. And in the group-based training, families are taught general principles, and they basically given skills, to understand their child's disability, and to help think, how do I learn for learning? How do I create an environment to motivate for communication, for socialization, etc. And it also provides very, very powerful or useful patient or parent and caregiver empowerment, for families not to feel isolated, for families not to feel they need to hide families who have similar challenges and similar needs. And that's been very powerful in our community and in many other parts of the world where people are busy piloting the CST program. And this picture, this colorful picture also from Little Chile, which is just to say, we're doing this project with many, many, many different partners. So it's the University of Cape Town and Autism South Africa, our non-profit, the government, many universities, many different teams, because we realized that we need everybody to give their input and contribution so that this becomes trying to do and convince the world that the project might be helpful. And so these are just some pretty pictures of the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different groups and people that we've been working with over the last few years to develop, to adapt, to train, to pre-pilot. And we're now, as soon as we can do piloting after COVID, we will be running the pilot for this as well. Principle number 5, and many more hours, is about task sharing with non-specialists. Remember, I showed you, and I said, in most low and middle income countries, there are very few highly specialized people. And a highly specialized person in our part of the world, a doctor is highly specialized, a nurse is highly specialized, a psychologist is highly specialized, a teacher is highly specialized. So we need to think, how do we work with people who are non-specialists? And the principle of task sharing looks a little bit like this. So if we imagine, I mentioned these very specialist interventions that we might do in our expert clinics or expert centers. We need to find ways of training colleagues who have slightly less expertise in the community to do perhaps a simpler version of an intervention, but still do it well. And they in turn need to find a way of sharing that task with non-specialist providers, so that the majority of providers are actually in the community, and that the most intervention is provided by people who are not experts. And by non-expert, I mean, it may be another mother, it might be a granny, it might be a different caregiver or a sibling who actually are the best at implementing some of these things. Now, we need to still make sure that we can do it well and that we have research evidence. So I'm going to show you just one example of a way in which we've been trying to look at and study task sharing. So this picture, it tells you about one particular autism intervention, the Early Start Denver model. Some of you might know about ESDM. Early Start Denver model was developed in the USA by Sally Rogers and Jerry Dawson. Sally's at the Mind Institute in California. And it was developed as a very specialist intervention, one-to-one, delivered by a psychologist or a specialist therapist and a child on their own. And they realized that that model isn't going to be sustainable either. And what we have done in this project in South Africa is Lauren Vries, who is a child psychiatrist, she's based in the USA. She has trained 3 of my team to be experts at ESDM. So Marissa is an occupational therapist, Noktula is a psychologist, Nalene is a psychologist, and they were trained to high standard, to international standard. They, in turn, trained early childhood development workers. So in South Africa, ECD workers I don't know if you have an equivalent, but you will have other kinds of groups of non-specialists. ECD workers have like 6 to 12 months of training, and they work as assistants, usually in early child development centers or in preschools. And so they then trained ECD workers to coach families, to coach mums and dads and grannies and family members to work with their child with autism. And in this, so you can see it's really from the specialist to the slightly less specialist to the non-specialist to the caregiver to the child. They don't work with the child, but they support and supervise the caregiver to work with that child. And we're asking the questions, you know, does it lead to improvement in social communication? What are the barriers and facilitators to this? Can these guys and can mums and dads really learn to do this intervention to fidelity? Do you remember, we want to make sure people do it well. And I'll give you just a short answer from the preliminary findings we have is it was possible for these guys to be trained, and they can train mums and dads to do this intervention. And within about 4 to 6 weeks, they can do it to the same fidelity that the expert psychologists see improvements in the language, in the socialization, in various measures of outcomes in a child. And so you can see this is an example of how we're trying to think differently about getting to children in communities for intervention. The sixth and last principle that I'm going to suggest is one about we have to think how to innovate. In our parts of the world, we don't do innovation because it's a cool thing to do. We do it because we have to. We cannot keep on thinking in the same way that we've thought so far. And so we're thinking how can we innovate with technology? How can we innovate with new screening and diagnostic tools? How can we come up with culturally fair interventions? Interventions are so culturally dependent, and many interventions from English countries like the UK or the US are very American or very British or very European, and that just doesn't always work in our kinds of settings. So, and how can we find new and better ways to train people? Because that's also a fundamental part of what we're doing. And so just a few examples. There's a very, very powerful program called the Autism Navigator. That's a web-based training developed by Amy Weatherby, there's her name, from Florida State University. And what Amy has done, she's a speech and language pathologist, what she's done over many years was to collect video material of typically developing children and children with ASD. And there's very nice training, and there's a little bit that's free. So if anyone wants to go and look at the Autism Navigator, there's a free we pick a developing child doing this social situation, and how does a child with autism do? And it's a very nice way to train people in the red flags or the risk markers for autism, for instance. And it's online. So during COVID, people were very interested, for instance, to learn how can we use more online-based trainings. The Navigator also has a training program for schools, for educators, and it also has an online coaching module so that Nola Chambers in my team is, for instance, she's been training people online to work with families at home, all through using technology and through remote modalities. So there's great scope for these sorts of things in the world. We're also interested in unusual things. So here, for instance, one of the engineers, Tosca in my team, she was interested to see, can we use EEG, brainwaves, as a marker for autism? Not because we want to build like, you know, fancy ivory tower EEG, but imagine that we might in a community where there are limited resources be able to do a very short test and see this is a child at risk. You can see that then might be a way for us to identify children early and reduce that big gap in the early years that I mentioned earlier. We're also very interested in how can we use smartphone technology. So here you can see a picture of two of the team in the community. This is family's home, and this is where we did one of our studies. And here you can see a mum and her child using a smartphone to screen risk of autism. Now, we're not just interested in can they fill in questionnaires online, because that's a little bit boring, and you know we know that that can happen. We are also interested to say, can we find language-free and culturally fair ways to screen? Because when you use language, you know, in my part of the world, in your part of the world, we have to translate it into 300 languages, and that's almost impossible. Are there ways in which we can screen without having to use language, for instance? And I will just show you these little examples. What we've done, and this is a project with Duke University in the USA, on an Apple phone, so on the smartphone, like, but then we also, on the phone, we showed children some little movies, and I will show you the little movies in a minute. And then the selfie camera recorded their facial expressions and tried to do automated coding of different facial expressions. And the question that we wanted to ask was, can we use how much time a child smiles at stimuli as a kind of a marker for autism? So let me just show you some of the stimuli. So here, for instance, you can, I don't know, can you see, is it moving? Rati, give me a thumbs up if it's moving. So there you saw some bubbles. Here you can see a little bunny hopping. That's this kind of movement of a non-biological and
the itsy bitsy spider went up the water
rhyme.
spout. Down came the rain and washed the spider out.
And then as I said, then what we did was we recorded facial landmarks. Here you can see what the landmarks look like on the camera. And then we used automated ways to quantify, to code. Here you can see a little face moving in. Now it's neutral. And now it's sort of moving to happy. Does that look like a happy face? Let's see, it's looked away. Yeah, that looks like a smile. And so the computer, the algorithm can automatically code these different emotions. And so you can see that if we can find these kinds of ways to identify children at risk without having to use language in ways that are culturally fair in your part of the world as it is in my part of the world, then we might actually make progress in finding children at risk. Then we can bring them into interventions more rapidly. But just a little cultural warning. And Diane and I were part of a symposium in the last few weeks on culture. One of the questions, of course, we have to ask is these things, these stimuli, you saw the bunnies and the nursery rhyme come from America. And the question we had to ask was, well, do children in Africa respond in the same way to these stimuli to children in America? And so we took a group of typically developing kids, preschool ones. So this was only until about the age of 5, I think. I stand to be corrected. And we looked at how much time did they look at the screen and how much time did they smile at the screen. And what you could see here, for the mirror image, for the bubbles, it was exactly the same in the African kids and in the American kids. But when we looked at the nursery rhyme and that funny little bunny, we saw that the African children and the American children looked as much at the same stimuli, but the American children smiled much more at those stimuli than the African children did. And so clearly, it's very subtle, but clearly showing that there are subtle cultural differences. And so that meant for us to realize we cannot use percentage time smiling as a marker for autism because it doesn't translate culturally across different settings. And so that's a really useful little detail for us to learn. We are very interested in tablet-based technologies. Can we use it for screening, for tracking intervention and other kinds of things? But all these we have to do very carefully, making sure that we don't make cultural mistakes in that sense. So let me wrap up, because I think that's enough for us to come into a conversation. We realize we need to build this pyramid of interventions, not just one thing. So some will answer. And we have to look at lots of different evidence to be able to answer that question. We really have to understand the needs of our families. And the needs of our families in Africa will be different from the needs of families in your part of the world. Some things might be universal, but some things might be very important differences culturally that needs it. Otherwise, we're not going to match the intervention with the cultural needs of a community. We need to think how to work with those health systems. In my part of the world, most of them are broken. So we need to think, how do we help fix them or make them stronger? And I think it's right that we don't wait until a child has a diagnosis. Maybe if they come into some basic intervention, we can use that as a way to help them guide to a diagnosis. But let's not wait until that's happened. We have to think, how do we work with non-specialists, and how do we acknowledge non-specialists as actually highly skilled people, even though they may not have the qualifications that you or I have. And we will have to keep on thinking, how can we innovate in our settings to make sure that we're heading in the right direction, and that we find new and different and better ways to identify, to treat, and to support people who live with autism and other disabilities. And just a reminder for all of you, and thinking back to Dr. Salis's comment, when we talk about autism, we immediately think of autism in the context of other developmental disabilities. I don't imply that autism is special or unique and different from other disabilities. Autism is just a very good example of the kinds of challenges that come with developmental disabilities. And so you will see so I'm working with the WHO on a global report on developmental disabilities. We're saying that there are more things that are similar. Challenges that people face with autism really are very good examples of the challenges that people also face who don't have autism. And so just two final messages to all of you, and then we can hopefully have some discussion. Families and people with autism really are our most important partners. And fortunately, in most of the world, that has changed. So we're seeing people who live with autism as lived experts, people with lived expertise. And we really need to make sure that we incorporate them in all the steps of our work, of our research, of our training, of our thinking. Second thing, and this is kind of a message and an encouragement to all of you, you've seen that picture. Most research about autism and disabilities come from high-income countries. And I really think it's important that those of us who are based in low and middle-income countries should contribute to these global efforts, should write papers, should do research, should get them out there, because that's the only way we're going to make sure that voices from low and middle-income countries are also heard and are incorporated into the growing literature about developmental disabilities and about autism. So that's my challenge to all of you and my encouragement to all of you about contributing to the research effort and to the outputs around autism and other developmental disabilities in the world. And with that, I'm going to say, if you're interested in the things we do, you can see our logo is a tree that grows, and it's deliberately meant to be something that's growing and that's alive. And it's a tree that wants to have fruits and that wants to have branches and that wants to link all over the world. So we'd be very keen to link with you if there are things we can link in. And as I said earlier, a lot of the things we talked about today were in a chapter of the Yakipap monograph. So this is a book that was recently published, and we wrote chapter 5 is very much about challenges and opportunities about early intervention in South Africa. And many of the concepts and examples I used today are also in this chapter. And finally, for those, if any of you don't know and haven't heard about YACAPAP, the International Association for Child and Adolescent Psychiatrists and Allied Professions, please go and look at the website. We're an international community of people interested in child and adolescent mental health and neurodevelopmental disability. And that's exactly how Diana and I met. So if it wasn't for YACAPAP, this symposium wouldn't have happened today. And we do all sorts of conferences. There are lots of resources. There's an open access, a freely available textbook in child mental health. There are MOOCs. There are all sorts of training and other opportunities. I really want to encourage you all to look at that and to consider joining in some of our activities. That, I'm going to say thank you. We have patient and questions. And Rati, with that, I shall hand back to you.
Well, thank you, Prof. Vries. I think it's really, really interesting, and I got so many new information about has a diagnosis. Whether we always learn to give intervention after a comprehensive assessment and its concluded diagnosis, but you have a new point of view, I think, and I'm pretty let the audience to ask to discuss in our Q&A session. Baik,
Sure. And I'm very happy for people to write questions in the chat.
Okay, so I will help out, Pati.
Write in chat box.
Your voice is a bit breaking out,
Irin
so
will
we can
translate
really listen to you well. So I'm going to help you for a bit now. Jadi Bapak Ibu, kalau misalnya ada pertanyaan, silahkan disampaikan dalam bahasa Indonesia juga boleh, atau diketik di chat box juga boleh. Nanti saya bantu untuk menerjemahkan pertanyaannya untuk Professor De Vries. So you can write your questions in the chat box, or you can raise your hand and ask directly to himself. Even if it is in Indonesia, I will help to translate it to Professor De Vries. Please, if you have any questions, you can raise your hands and unmute yourself. Or if you feel a little bit shy to ask him directly, you can write it on the chat box. While we're waiting, I think I'm going to give you one question, because we have students here in our audience who are currently in the middle of their training to be a clinical psychologist, which is at the end of the day, they will be on the top of the pyramid. So I was wondering what kind of contribution that they can do in terms of building the pyramid that you talk about in this session.
Yeah, great, thank you. And you're quite right. So clinical psychologists are highly qualified and highly skilled people in any part of the world. And in fact, in many parts of the world, say in America, clinical psychologists are often the people who diagnose autism as well. So diagnosticians and treaters. And they often children with autism often only come to medical professionals when they have co-occurring physical health problems or co-occurring mental health problems, which of course we know is a common co-occurring thing. So I guess if I have a message to clinical psychologists or clinical psychologists in training, it is to say, number one, remember that as knowledge about autism increases in the world, the expectations on us as experts increases too. So we can no longer just know a little bit about autism and a little bit about intervention. We need to make sure that we train ourselves well so that we can support people and supervise people with expert knowledge. That's number one. So have very high expectations of your knowledge about autism and disabilities. Number two, it's very important that all of you should know and believe the change of paradigm that has happened in interventions for autism and developmental disabilities. And let me tell you what I mean by that. Even 20 years ago, if I asked a group of clinical psychologists, do you think we can fundamentally treat or change the core difficulties in autism? Most of you would have said, no, we can't, but we can kind of work around the difficulties of autism. But today, we have very good evidence that yes, we can and we should work around the difficulties of autism, but we can also work through the difficulties of autism. We can improve the communication skills, we can improve the language skills, we can improve the turn-taking, the social reciprocity, the repetitive and stereotype behaviors. And by doing that, we can actually also improve the overall developmental outcomes for children. I didn't show you pictures, but some of the data, for instance, from programs like ESDM, the Early Start Denver model, showed that if children had the intervention, before they started the intervention, they had limited language, IQs in the intellectually disabled range, and after the intervention, after 12 to 24 months of the intervention, most of them were speaking, and all their IQs increased into the normal IQ range. And so there's something very fundamental that has shifted in our thinking about autism. So you have to have high expectations of yourself, but then you also need to have high expectations of what interventions can do to improve the lives and the outcomes of children with autism. And the third thing is, but we need to do the right kinds of interventions. It's not just anything will do. So that is where we do come into making sure that we use contemporary evidence-informed and evidence-based approaches. And the big umbrella for certainly in autism and in developmental disabilities increasingly is what we call naturalistic developmental behavioral interventions. I don't know if you're all familiar with that concept, NDBIs. So NDBIs, and just a few words about each of those, they're naturalistic because we are now saying a child doesn't have to come into a clinic office. We actually should treat them in a naturalistic setting, at home, on the bus, going to school, playing in the garden, going to the shops. That's the naturalistic setting. Number two, it's developmental. So we need to know that, and you as psychologists will know, developmental stages. And if a child is here, we want to build on that to help them get to the next developmental stage. It's behavioral NDB, because we do use behavioral principles, you know, the kinds of principles that you might use in ABA, applied behavioral analysis, but we embed it into natural activities, natural reinforcers. So people have moved away from the very strict and old-fashioned kinds of ABA-based approaches. And the fourth bit is, and we have to do everything in partnership with families and communities. So the idea that the therapist does something and then goes away is no longer the model for intervention, but the therapist, you as the expert, empowering the family and supporting them to coach a child. And just the last word, Diane, and I can see you're writing all sorts of things in languages I can't understand. There's a conceptual difference for you as psychologists. There's a difference between coaching and other approaches to intervention. When you intervene, like if you're a teacher, you're quite didactic. So you instruct, you model, you show, you do. When you are a coach, you have to get the mum or the caregiver to be the boss. And so your process is different. You need to say to them, what do you think happened that made the child do that? What do you think can you do that might make a difference? Or what did you do that actually made that difference? So that they are the active participant in the process. And so coaching is also something that I think would be a really important skill for all of you as psychologists and as therapists to think, just how do I improve my own coaching skills, not just my own therapeutic skills. So was that a useful start, Diane?
Yes, definitely. I write the translation because the translator need to go to the restroom. So I'm doing double job here. So is everyone any questions? Ada pertanyaan dari teman-teman mahasiswa profesi, dari Bapak Ibu dosen sekalian?
Hello.
Yes, silahkan.
Hello. Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Theoria. I want to ask that Mr. said that you already started a trend of online intervention for autism. Sorry.
Yes, go on.
Okay. You already started the trend of online intervention for autism. Did you find any different result between the online intervention and direct intervention? Because actually, for what I've known, we just started to look at online intervention because of the pandemic in Indonesia.
Yeah.
Did you find any different result, or what happened with the children with online and the direct intervention? Thank you.
Sure. That's a great question, Julia. I'm going to give you two answers. The first answer is there's actually quite good evidence from other studies, including the Early Start Denver model, including the Autism Navigator, that you can coach people remotely, and that you can have very good, just as good clinical outcomes as you have with face-to-face, okay? In our own work in South Africa, just like you, the work we've done online, we didn't compare with face-to-face. And because of the pandemic, we've only just started doing the online. So we are beginning to have enough data to do the comparison, and we're going to do it. But I don't have in my group comparative data of the two. So it's like two different data sets. So we know there's good evidence that you can do this task sharing training in person and it works. We know that actually it does look as though the online and remote training also works. I just can't show you that directly comparing the two in the same setting, that the one is just as good as the other. But the evidence that we see and the feedback that we are getting from families and the measurements that we're beginning to collect certainly looks as though online training has many benefits, and that it can be a really useful option. It does get a little bit more difficult than that, and I will just give you some example. For instance, when we do the live sessions in the Early Start Denver model, we get people to do, for instance, in the room, a session would start with the caregiver and the child just playing for a few minutes, and then we would ask them about that, and then we would model something, and then they would practice it. And we can't do it in exactly the same way online. So we can't really say to a mom, okay, now play with your child, I'm going to watch you. So we've had to change the way that we do that. So what we now do is we actually get the caregiver to record a few minutes of their playing with a child and uploading it before the session. And then it can be watched a movie in the session. So we've had to change some of the ways we do things, but there is another really important consideration, and you will need to tell me how much of an issue it is in Indonesia. What COVID has done is it's moved all of us towards technology. The whole world has shifted to technology, to talk to our families, to teach, to train, to learn, to play. You know, I've been sat in front of this computer for the last 9 months. And it's fine if you have technology that is, you have fast internet, you have super broadband, you can easily connect, you have easy access to data, it's cheap and affordable, then shifting to technology is not a big problem. But remember, we work in low and middle income countries, we work in low resource settings, and in my part of the world, only about 20% of families have fixed internet at home. Yeah, only 20%. Most people access internet through Wi-Fi. Many of them have to don't have Wi-Fi at home. They have to use it through hotspots or through data. It's expensive. Often people share phones. So in Africa, it's not uncommon that 2 or 3 or 4 different people would share the same phone. And so there are many technical challenges about using remote modalities. And so the risk for us is if we're not careful about that, we already have an intervention divide between rich countries and poor countries, but we also have a digital divide. The World Bank calls it the digital divide. There's already a big digital divide between rich countries and poor countries. And the divide has been getting bigger rather than smaller over the last 10 years. And so your very good question is, of course, there's potential. If there's a choice between nothing and remote, of course remote will work. And maybe remote might sometimes even be better for people who are far away from clinics, who are in very remote areas where it takes, there might be advantages to doing it remotely. But then we need to think, is it available to people? Is it affordable to people? Is it accessible to people? How do we need to change how we do the intervention to make it okay? Offline, so we do like asynchronous, as I said. They record, we talk, but we don't do everything online at the same time to manage these technologies. If we can manage the kind of thinking carefully about it, I think we can make very good progress, and technology can be most helpful in our parts of the world. But if we just think everything should quickly go online, we might actually disadvantage the people who've already been disadvantaged even more. What do you think about that? Maybe you can give me your response to my comment.
I think our country, that Africa and Indonesia, for the internet or some gadget is equally the same for me. So some of them, the intervention is not gonna work if accessibility is very, very low, right? But when the access is reachable, so we can do the intervention of online with the best that we have, something like that.
Yeah.
Am I right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So maybe the problem is in internet. So it's not what I thought. Sorry. And what I thought is everything is not reachable because our theory as a psychological, some of the theory is kind of old, I think. So it's not really can be upgraded to online, but when we can be better in online situation, so everything is quite
and
promising, right?
Absolutely. And so remember, I differentiate between, and people do use remote modalities for face-to-face therapy as well. So there's good evidence. You can do cognitive behavioral therapy, you as the therapist, me as the patient. You can do acceptance and commitment therapy, you as the therapist, me as the patient. In autism, what we're talking about more is about not doing the therapy with a child, but you being the coach to the mother, to the caregiver. And then it's more equal. Then you're going to say to mom, so how has the last week been? What's he been up to? How have your homework been? What have you tried to do? And mom might say, well, he still wants to go back to the things he's interested in. And then, so there's like a problem-solving joint thing. And that's where technology can be really helpful. And, let me give you one example from ESDM. For instance, one of the rules that we teach people, one of those developmental rules, is called the 1-up rule. Do you know the 1-up rule of language?
Never heard of them. Sorry.
Okay. So the 1-up rule. So and just to illustrate, because I think sometimes it's the simple principles that make the biggest difference for families. So the 1-up rule is if we make mum aware, or the caregiver aware, of what is the expressive language level of your child now. And then mum might say, well, he doesn't say any words at the moment. So no words. Okay. So then it means, then we say, okay, so the rule, or mum might say he speaks in little short sentences, but not long sentences. So then we're going to say to mum, so the 1-up rule. And then we might send them a little WhatsApp picture of the 1-up rule. And then when we meet in the supervision session, then we say, okay, let's talk about the 1-up rule. The 1-up rule is, if your child has no words, you are going to communicate with them using single words. If your child is using single words, you're going to communicate with them using 2-word phrases. If your child's using 2-word phrases, you're going to communicate with them using slightly longer phrases. Can you see that's just the one up? It's one level up from where you are. Because what that does is that helps us pull the child to the next level of their language development. Yeah. The problem is that most parents would, or most people, until they know that, they might think, I need to keep talking and keep talking and keep talking and keep talking. And actually, that doesn't necessarily have meaning to the child. And so you can see a very simple principle, and then we can say as part of that to mom, okay, we might see, and mom might say, oh yes, no, look, I used a very long sentence and he didn't respond. And then we might say, so what do you think you do why we can teach non-specialists these principles? You as a clinical psychologist will have many more models and theories and theoretical frameworks to pick up things, but many of these core fundamental principles, I think we can train people very well to do very accurately. So does that give you a sense of how we can
Sorry, Peter, can you repeat for the last part a little bit, because you are breaking out? Your voice is a little breaking out.
Right.
Just the last part.
Yeah. See, that's internet problems, even for us, right? Technology.
Yeah.
So that's just that. I wanted to use that just as an illustration of how we can, if we can understand the principles, we can summarize them in simple ways so that even non-specialists can help coach families, and that even mums and dads and people anywhere can understand the principle and then implement that at home. So that's what we're trying to do with that whole funnel of cascaded interventions. And we can use technology for that too.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Very, very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Theoria. Is there any questions? Ada pertanyaan lagi dari Bapak Ibu?
Can I ask something?
Yes, sure.
Okay.
Laras.
Sure. My name is Laras. So just as what you said before, we should do early interventions even before the diagnosis. So what about the awareness about autism itself? Because as we know, parents from low or middle income country are not always concerned about mental health or their child's condition or their child's mental health. So how can we do early interventions when the parents are not always really willing to do it for their child? Thank you.
Sure. And I mean, in a way, you're asking two questions, I think. The first is, it is very important for us to do awareness raising about autism and developmental disabilities across all levels of society. In our part of the world, you will know what it's like in Indonesia. I don't. Parents and communities don't know much about autism, but even doctors and specialists don't know much about autism. And even the decision makers in government don't know much about autism. So the awareness really needs to be across all levels. And that's where parent organizations who do advocacy and lobbying. So we work very closely in South Africa with Autism South Africa and other autism non-profits, with Autism Speaks. That's where things like the World Health Organization a few years ago, they passed a resolution to say autism is a public health concern and governments and society should respond. So, and that's an ongoing thing that I think all of us should do. So you're absolutely right. And often clinical psychologists and psychologists, you're very good at helping to support advocacy campaigns, to identify challenges for advocacy, etc. So that's a really important thing to do. The second part of your question was about parents not wanting to seek support. And I think that's about, in part, about awareness and knowledge, but that also interfaces with societal pressures, stigma, cultural belief systems, and those sorts of things. So no parent would deliberately want to prevent their child from receiving medical or other input if they understand why and what the needs are. And so there's also something about how we communicate these messages in culturally appropriate ways to people. And I'll give you an example. So very often, the most common reason why children in Africa come to attention is because they're not speaking at the right time. So 2-year-old boys, they're not speaking. Mum says, I'm worried he's not speaking. And then what happens is dad says, oh, don't worry, he's just a boy, he will talk later. That's fine. So we need to do knowledge sharing and information so that they understand that that's not necessarily the case. That's why there's a lot of effort on these red flags for autism, so that people understand if you see this, seek the next level. But then what also often happens is then mum finally goes to the clinic. She feels brave and she goes to the nurse, and the nurse in the clinic says, oh, don't worry, come back in 1 year if it's not better. Or they go to the doctor and the doctor says, oh, he's a boy, come back when he's 4 if he's still not speaking. So you can see, even at that next level, we need to make sure that people don't give false reassurance. So there's a balance between advocacy and training, understanding the kind of the cultural and stigma barriers that people have to go through. And once again, that's where you as psychologists are often, what are all the different factors that I need to pull together? What's my whole biopsychosocial formulation around why there's a barrier, why there's a blockage, what are the challenges, so that you can then come up with a rounded, a kind of a multi-level strategy to do it. It's not just about a simple TV campaign or radio campaign. It's also about understanding the drivers that prevents people from accessing care, or that makes them hesitant about accessing care. And you will know, for most people, most families who live with disability, in most parts of the world, disabilities still come with a lot of shame, stigma, guilt, ignorance. And it's very interesting. We, a few years ago, we, at the Yakapap that Diane and I were part of conference a few years ago, a student from Pakistan presented a piece of work. He worked in a pediatrics clinic. He was a psychologist, and he asked a group of families who had a child diagnosed with autism, and they asked about stigma and shame and things like that. And they had a group of families where the children were diagnosed with severe childhood cancers. And they looked at the stigma, the impact, and the stress associated with autism versus severe childhood cancer. Which of those two groups do you think reported the highest level of stigma, shame, family burden, distress, and so on?
The autism.
Yeah. So you can see that there are many levels of kind of psychological processes that we need to work with to understand the needs of families. And you're right, I mean, it was striking to us. Logically, if you have a child who's been diagnosed with cancer, surely that should be worse. But here we see the evidence that a diagnosis of autism feels like more of a challenging diagnosis and for people. So I've learned that it's not just unwillingness from families that they don't bring their child. You know, when the kid comes to the clinic age 5 and they're not saying a word, we shouldn't be saying, you know, why didn't you bring your child 3 years ago, you stupid mother? Because there are so many pathways, so many barriers, and so many things. And that's why your question is a super important one about how do we raise that awareness, but also how do we raise the awareness to empower people to come forward to seek support.
Okay, so I think from your answers, we should work with non-profit associations to raise the awareness and also try to reduce the stigma maybe about mental health, right?
Yeah, And that's an ongoing process, I think, in all parts of the world. And it needs to look different in different parts of the world. So just as I said, with the seed and the soil and the watering can, we can't just say, here's an anti-stigma campaign from the USA, let's implement it in Indonesia. Or here's an anti-stigma or a program from the UK, let's put it in South Africa. Because we might misunderstand the kind of contextual, cultural, and local factors that are important to make sure that we hit the right target. So that's maybe my key message to you all today is, don't think you just need to bring in things from elsewhere. You need to generate your own perspectives, your own knowledge, your own information. Nobody will understand your systems and your people better than you yourself. And then you should think, what therefore is the most relevant thing in my context, for my families, in my cultural, linguistic, and socioeconomic context.
Okay, thank you so much, Prof.
Thank you.
Okay, so there's one question on the chat box, but basically you already answered it because he's asking about raising awareness as well as Laras asked. So she has two questions, from Hasbi. The second questions, I think it's also important for us as either psychologist or as a researcher, how we can help the bigger society or people who are, or family who has individual with special needs, either it's autism or other disorder, how we can help them in terms of in the level of regulations, formal regulations, what kind of information, what kind of advocacy we can do to push the regulations. As you mentioned a little bit that you work with the Parents Association to push the regulations in South Africa, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, did you get my question, Petrus?
Okay.
Did you get?
So your sound was broken up. So let me repeat it and see if I understood. You said, how can we? And by regulations, do you mean things like policies or legislation and those kinds of things?
Yes, how we can help to push the regulations.
So I think everything we think of as the need to combine all levels of society. So by that, I work in an academic institution, but we work very closely with non-profit organizations. We also think it's really important to work in collaboration with government or government, legislative bodies. So how things work, and it's different in health and social care and education, but what we try to do is with family organizations and with the WHO to point out to our government some of the gaps and some of the challenges, so by giving them evidence base, and then try to propose to them how we can change policies and legislation for families. So for instance, how can, at the moment, I'll give you one example from education. In South Africa, the legal school-going age is from your 7th birthday until your 15th birthday. And what that means is if you have a child with autism, even if they're diagnosed at the age of 3 or 4, legally, they don't have to go to school until they are 7. And given everything we've said about early intervention, we want to make sure that they are in school when they are 3 or 2, not when they're 7. And there are, because we don't have enough school placements for children in the country, they typically, before the official school, they're on a waiting list, they wait at home, they don't get any intervention, they don't get any education. And so we've been working over a number of years now to try and get them to agree that that minimum age needs to be brought down for children with disabilities to the age of 3. That's what we're currently lobbying for. And there's a white paper, so that means the government is looking at it to make that go down. So you can see when we generate evidence, the key thing, if we really want to do research that has an impact in society, we have to do it in partnership with the people who make those decisions. And so what we also try to do is to bring those people into our research programs from very early on, so that they can be part of the process rather than feel that they are just challenged by our research and by our findings. So that's one example, how we're trying to do it with education, to get educational ages right, with health in terms of access to care, and with our social development to get disability funding support for families. Because the world, many families have very limited income and they get very little disability support. And so we're also trying to make sure that we're lobbying for that. But the trick is governments are more likely to listen to families now to professionals, to academics. And that's why we need in working with the voices of people who live with disabilities, because really more likely to have an impact on regulations, on laws, and on these kind of things. And of course, you in your part of the world also is from the WHO, from the World Health Organization, because we can use those as evidence, and we can use any reports from the UNICEF. So there should be a UNICEF report next year on developmental disabilities. Those are all tools you and I can use to go to the important people in our countries to say, look, UNICEF says we must do something. The WHO says we must do something. What are we going to do? And then collaborative with your governments or the decision makers around those challenges.
Thank you.
It'll be different everywhere, so that those are just a couple of examples.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the key thing that we should do is collaboration with so many different partners as possible, especially with our government as well. I think we are already almost 2 hours online because we are enjoying this talk very much, so we don't really feel the time pass by. I think we can end it here, but before I end these talks, I would like to sum up a little bit of what Professor De Vries talked about today. So he shared a lot of interesting research about autism in South Africa, and he shared that we have 6 principles that we can refer to develop a more widespread and a more sustainable intervention, especially for autism. The first one is implementing the pyramid of interventions. The more low intensity intervention should be accessible to the wider populations, and the more high intensity should be provided by the more expert people. But we can task sharing with a non-specialist. And then the second one, we can use evidence-based, but it's not necessarily only about efficacy, whether the intervention is effective or not, or working or not to intervene the disorder. And then the third one, we can understand the needs of families, communities, and health systems because they are our main priorities in terms of helping them coping with their situations, with the situation in the family. And then the fourth one, we cannot wait until the child has a diagnosis, so we have to start as early as possible to help the children to reach the next developmental stages better. And then the fifth is task sharing with non-specialists. I think this is also related to the first point, where the pyramid intervention implemented for offering the intervention. And then the last one, I think, is very relevant in our setting. we have to be innovative because we have a lot of limitations. We have challenges. We have gaps compared to a more developed and high-income countries who already have more resources to help the community. So I think that's a very interesting and very important for us to learn. 6 points, 6 principles, and then the session Q&A session is also very fruitful, especially for me who is not a clinical psychologist. So I have to learn a lot about the disorder. And then before I close the sessions, would you share with us for like a closing statement for us, Petrus?
Thank you. And I see Dr. Salis also has his hand up, so we should give him a closing statement as well.
Of course.
But from me, really, I think when we started, Dr. Salis said, you're looking forward to learning from me. But I think when it comes to disabilities and autism, it's about learning together. And I think it's about learning together with colleagues in other parts of the world. And it's about learning together with professional colleagues. And it's learning together with governments. And most importantly, learning together with families and people who live with disabilities. Because if we keep them in mind, we know we will be moving in the right direction. And so that's kind of my wish for all of you, to have a really kind of positive activity. And I'm delighted to hear that you're all interested as a faculty in disability and disability studies and disability work, not just as an academic discipline, but as something so that you can really make a difference and have a real impact in your community. So thank you for the lovely invitation, and good luck and congratulations on all the wonderful things that you're also doing. And as Dr. Salis said, hopefully one day I can meet you all in person. We can eat some nice Indonesian food together.
Of course, of course. And then thank you very much for the closing statement from Professor Vries. And I would like to share the time with Dr. Salis for the, mungkin bisa sekalian ditutup Pak, for the closing as well.
Okay. Thank you very much. I only want to highlight that someday, as you said, that someday we need to talk more details, at least for 2 points. Yeah, we need to discuss more detail about at least 2 points. The first one is how we can educate, how we can coach, how we can treat for autism, for community, for family better. Yeah. And the second thing is, I really interest when you say that we need to understand our culture, yeah, our own culture, because the etiology and the best way how we understand autism in our community, if we understand the culture of our own community. So we need to have collaboration about research. I think that is my point. First, we need to talk more about the detail of coaching program, about education programs. And the second things, if you don't mind, I really hope in the someday, yeah, we can do research collaborations. And as my statement, thank you very much, Professor Petrus. Your speech is very fruitful and very beneficial for us. We learned a lot, and hopefully all participants also get the same thing as me and also as Dian. Yeah, and I really hope next time we can work and do collaboration again. And sebagai penutup, saya sampaikan terima kasih untuk semua yang hadir, dan semoga semuanya sehat selalu. Ya, please take care of ourselves. Ya, follow the health protocol because COVID is still in the next doors. Ya, masih di depan pintu kita. Ya. Demikian saja. Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much, Professor Vries. So that's the closing from Dr. Salis. We hopefully can see you again next time in more sessions next time. I don't know whether it's still online, or I hope it's not online. But personally, I wish you a healthy condition there in Cape Town, and then have a nice Christmas holiday. Thank you very much. Terima kasih semuanya. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you, everyone.